Hi, welcome to Money Isn't Everything. I'm Mary Wisniewski, Cornerstone Advisors, editor-at-large and host of the show. Today on Money Isn't Everything, I am chatting with Ryan Falvey, who is the co-founder and managing partner at Restive Ventures. And this is a firm that invests in early-stage fintech companies. And he's also someone I know from my early days of reporting. So it's like super fun to talk fintech with him. And we get into the regulatory wishes and predictions for the industry, shoot the breeze about banking as a service in a post-synapse crisis environment. And we also chat about productivity hacks. Here's our convo. Well, hello, Ryan. Thank you so much for being on Money Isn't Everything. It's really good to see your face.
Yeah, nice to see you too. It's been a bit.
Yeah, it's been a bit. And there's a lot going on. Gosh, I mean, FinTech 2024 was, there's a lot of ways to slice and dice it. I was going to say horrible, but that's because I'm thinking of Synapse. But there's a lot of promising things too.
Ups and downs.
Ups and downs. I guess that's just the way of life. But yeah, I wanted to get into a lot of things with you. But I think to start with, we're in a new political environment. And I know you are someone who's paid attention a lot of like what needs to happen with regulations in terms of what would help someone's financial health by way of like fintech can do better things because of this regulation, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm, general question to open this. But what's your prognosis for fintech in 2025, especially in this newer political environment?
Yeah, well, maybe not a surprise since we're early stage investors into fintech companies. We're pretty bullish on the category. We're excited. I mean, I think there's a couple of things coming together. Maybe I'll drill on the regulatory side in a second. But just as a broader context, we do have some pretty significant technological transformations underway, and obviously people talk about AI a lot in various use cases, but we're clearly seeing the impact of those technologies on the startup creation and the speed with new companies are coming to market, and also just entirely new approaches towards solving some of the problems of the financial service industry that make it kind of generally an exciting time to be investing into early stage fintech, to be an early stage founder, and to be thinking around, where are some of the new opportunities to come in.
Tell me a little bit about that. What's the first thing that pops into your mind when you're thinking about this? Like, hey, this is an example of like, oh, this wasn't done this way before, and I'm excited about it.
Oh, like all of it. The biggest thing I think there's a lot when people talk about kind of AI, like there's like these foundation models like ChatGPT and Claude and Anthropic, and then there's companies that are building applications on top of it, and there's this debate a little bit in technology whether it's going to be the application layer or these foundation models that capture all the value. I kind of think that that's honestly kind of irrelevant. If you're creating anything in our society and you know what you're doing, these tools dramatically increase your productivity. Whether you're running a podcast and you could now prep much more quickly for interviews, or if you're starting a startup where you have to do a lot of stuff that's really not core to your business, but you're just creating things. You've got to write a lot of code. If you're operating financial services, you'll need to come up with a lot of explanations around what you're doing. You'll need to create marketing, and so for people who are in entities that are really early in their creation cycle, these tools dramatically accelerate how much they can accomplish. And that the benefits really inure to people who know what they're doing. So like you've been a good example. You've been a journalist for a long time. You've had a podcast. You're really good at creating content that resonates with people. You gotta know what works. If you and I both started a new publication tomorrow, we could use a lot of these tools to create a lot of this kind of foundational things really quickly. A business plan, maybe like some marketing for what the website looks like, maybe some early articles. The difference is you would know what that, like the quality stuff that these tools are producing, and you'd be like, okay, this is good. And you'd be able to edit it and tweak it.
Yeah.
And you'd be producing really high quality stuff. I was so very producing low quality things.
Thank you for giving me accolades.
I would just start articles and no one will look at them. So I wouldn't get the same benefit that you get from it. And that other thing is when you think of startups, for the best founders, we've seen just a real acceleration of their growth over like really the last, I'd say 18 to 24 months, with companies that are generating more revenue where they are in their life cycle than companies 3 years ago.
Yeah.
About with twice as much time. So I think from the startup perspective, it's been a really kind of dark time for investors over the last couple of years. And so there's a negative narrative out there around fintech. But I think from the actual companies we've seen who have been produced, they're actually doing really, really well. And I think over the next year, whether or not we had a change in the regulatory environment, you would have been hearing from a lot more startups in the market as they grow and really develop new businesses, because we've just seen a lot of new innovation and new ideas, and it really is quite broad.
Well, Ryan, I do want to ask you more about this because it's something interesting. So you're saying I would recognize, like, if I'm using like ChatGPT to do like an article or something, I'll be able to edit it and make it better because I have that expertise. Do you think like because one thing I am a little concerned about it would be like, oh, people who think they can do things, but like if they put it in front of someone who's done that, they might not realize, oh, it's actually not so good. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like, yes.
Yeah, no, I think you still get what I've seen so far is you still get the benefit of quality. This is a good example. I mean, we're talking about issues that require knowledge base amongst the listener, the viewer, the reader. Like they kind of need to already care about financial services and fintech. And so if someone were just produce generic ChatGPT written stories about fintech, they just wouldn't be interesting to the readers that and viewers that would otherwise tune into something like this. I think the benefit, like where you'd see it, like to kind of extend this analogy, is maybe instead of hiring reporters to work for you, or maybe hiring like editors, you could offload some of that work to this, and so you're become more productive. Maybe you offload parts of the work that that you really don't have a competitive advantage. Maybe the editing of what you're looking at, or maybe the marketing of the product. And
for me, it's always a slide. I'm like, how do you like? What? How do you put that text box in again?
But I think that in startups, it's a little bit different, because like what the main thing these companies are doing, like the people who are there for the first year, they're like typing code onto their computer.
Yeah.
And that is like a big difference. So if you're already a really talented technical founder and you kind of know what you're trying to do, you're just much, much more productive. Because unlike, the breakdown on this analogy is as we're creating content, like it's really hard to tell, right? It's qualitative. It might be good. There's a lot of judgment associated with it.
Yeah,
code would generally work. Sure, it doesn't work. And so if you're using some of these things to kind of generate some code alongside you, and the code doesn't work, like it's pretty obvious that it didn't work, and you can go fix it. But generally it's working, and the person who's creating it is having it offloading a task onto it that might be laborious and might be taking them time, and it's making them more efficient. And that is where I think you're really getting the advantage, is they're just building the product much more quickly.
Yeah, I kind of like using ChatGPT. I sort of like ideas of things that I might not have thought about. So like I'm still finessing the way I do a prompt, because I understand that it's like a total art, and I'm like I don't quite know what the right words sometimes, but I'm like, hey, I want to like use this in a way that helps me vision board for like things I hadn't considered, things outside of my brain. So there's that. But I want to bring up another very nerdy subject, and I know it's sort of like, who knows, because of the CFPB getting, attacked, or one might say they're attacking. It just depends where you fall in your political belief here. But open banking seemed to have made some traction, and now I would imagine a little bit of a mystery of what's next. But I'm curious of like, what you think is next for open banking, or what the fintech firms you've invested in, what they're thinking about, or maybe they're not thinking about that. But I'm curious your take there.
Yeah. Well, I obviously don't know what will come of it. I think my thought this year is I think we're entering into basically a period of banking deregulation. we one of like the first times we really kind of have seen that going back really to since the late 90s. You think about like at a really high level, the vast majority of the regulation that exists is for banks and insurance companies. It is for regulated entities, and there's a lot of rules and a lot of guidelines around that. And for most of, we think about how that regulation's been extended to fintech, it's extending existing regulation. It's bringing these non-banks underneath the regulatory framework. And a lot of what the CFPB does is extends that kind of more broadly. That's been driven in large part because like the regulated financial services industry would be pointing at the fintechs and be like, well, how come they're not covered by these rules too?
Yeah.
How come we're not, they don't have to play by these same set of rules. And so open banking, a lot of how it's been constructed is a way of trying to like the non-bank saying, well, we should be able to get access to it. And there's this kind of tension between, on one hand, having to kind of come underneath some of the rules. And I think if you look at, if you were to distill down, the open bank rules, they're an attempt at a compromise between the tension of how much of the rule should the non-bank, have to be bound by versus how much access should I get to this data, and trying to find a compromise there. I think what we're going towards is for the next couple of years, probably is a very different market where I don't think the banks and the regulated financial services is super focused on regulating fintech as much as reducing their own regulation. And like businesses generally don't think through the lens of like, I want to be less regulated, but I want them to be more regulated. Like that's a confusing message. Like a better message is, I would like to have less controls over executive compensation. I would like to have lower capital requirements for my bank. I would like to not have to follow these rules as tightly. There should be more sensitivity on it. And that generally is going to reduce the regulatory burden for banks. And I think in doing so, even further reduce it for non-banks, for the fintech.
Well, this is a slight segue, but you've got me thinking about this now, because it's sort of, what do you think the state of the fintech partnering with the bank is now? And I'm thinking, of course, of like the terrible Synapse thing where people couldn't get their money, and what does that say about banking as a service today or the future? But I'm kind of curious how you're viewing that. Like I'm hearing like banks say, hey, we're still working with fintech, but we're being extra thoughtful to which ones we work with, which is that's vague. So like I don't know how real that is or how not real that is, but I'm curious, what do you see?
We're seeing there's a maturation of the industry. I think it's probably the easiest way to think about it. So the banking as a service kind of middleware was always had the kind of a challenging component to it, that it was a middleman. It's between a bank that has a license and a fintech that was the agent, which was going to, in the eyes of regulators, extend that license. And so what a lot of these banking as a service providers did was make it easier, air quotes, to
always air quotes. I think this is an industry that needs air quotes.
It made it easier to extend financial services. And easier generally means like kind of faster and maybe a little bit looser. And so you have some players who probably weren't quite as buttoned up and were relying on this middleware provider for the buttoning. And there's a risk there because oftentimes these banks weren't particularly sophisticated either. Well, what's happened is you've ended up with a couple of players like on the non-bank side, fintechs, which are quite sophisticated. I don't think, Chime, arguably, I don't know, I don't have any special insight at Chime, but my guess is from a regulatory compliance standpoint, they're probably more sophisticated than about 90% of the banks in the country. And so they're effectively operating like a bank at this point. I mean, a bank license, and they probably have some market power for when they go talk to banks of who they'll partner with. And I'm sure a lot of banks are willing to work with them because they got a large installed customer base and a business that's pretty predictable and from all media reports, profitable. And so that I think is like, that's just a natural maturation in the industry. Meanwhile, you have a lot of players, small companies that we invest in that, maybe not, and maybe hadn't broken through, maybe don't have scale, really aren't driving significant revenue, and might really at the end of the day might represent more of a liability and some risk to some of these institutions. And so you're going to see the market kind of pull back from them. So I don't know if that's necessarily like, I think you'll continue to see bank fintech partnerships. I think you'll probably see an acceleration of those over the coming years again. But I think, some of the heyday of being able to go partner with a BaaS provider and get live in, a couple of weeks is probably not coming back. That's it.
And that's kind of wild to think about, like that could happen and that quickly, or could.
Yeah.
Ryan, before I take you on another rabbit hole, there's one segment of the show, and it's called "That's What You Said," but that's what you wrote, and you wrote it in a bank thing, and it's sort of related to what we're talking about, but maybe it's a little bit different because you published it in October, so again before the election, but it was like you were offering guidance of like what would be some ways to reset the regulatory agenda to foster I love this word creativity, but I know it can be viewed as a negative too, but I mean it as a positive in this way. But you wrote, there is a massive trade-off too big to fail. It discourages risk-taking and innovation. And so, I think that's like really interesting. And I know we're sort of in a different time moment now, but can we unpack that a little bit? Yeah.
I think that, I was trying to write so that it would apply kind of no matter what the election outcome is. But I do think over the last several years, and I'll say over the last administration, it became, I think, from certain policymakers, increasingly obvious that there was a view that these larger institutions were the safer.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you think about the banking crisis we had with SVB and the First Republic.
Yeah.
We went back 5 years and said the solution to a banking crisis is to have JP Morgan buy another bank. Would have been very shocking, I think, for policymakers. Like that was what we were trying to avoid happening. Like a lot of Dodd-Frank and a lot of the response to the financial crisis, the idea was to make the big banks smaller, mm-hmm. easier to control, less profitable. Maybe the market forces would kind of break them up. Maybe you'd have more innovation at the regionals and smaller banks. And I think that that shifted to, hey, these big banks are, maybe not the best, but they're run pretty well. They're easy to control, and like it's better off having a few big ones that are kind of politically sensitive and are predictable, rather than having 15,000 financial institutions and however many tens of thousands of fintechs running around creating chaos. I think that that's a terrible policy.
Mm-hmm.
I think that policy encourages the large financial institutions just to get bigger and bigger. And the way you get bigger in the United States is to swap out poor people for richer people.
Mm-hmm.
Swap out middle-class people for upper middle-class people. It's a swap out upper middle-class people for mass affluent for the wealthy. If you could have a bank that only banked the top 100 people and the 100 families in the country, that'd be great. You'd have huge deposit base. You'd have really safe loans, and you'd have some customer service. It'd be an amazing business, and you'd be making money hand over fist. But it wouldn't serve the U.S. economy. And I think that, the kind of the crackdown on some of these partnerships, in particular focused on smaller institutions, it was discouraging innovation in a destructive way. And so that's kind of what we were going for there. And I think the point I was trying to make, and when I think about some of the policy ideas we had, they bring technology into the regulatory environment, where
mm-hmm.
well, a lot of the regulation, these banks are so complicated that this really it's a process. It's checklists that they're going through, and they're making sure that the process is appropriate rather than if the business makes sense. And they're kind of loath to question business judgment. And so that tends to penalize institutions that can't really keep up with the process, and maybe the process isn't quite as tight, but this is actually pretty safe. And so to that's an area where technology can kind of come in and say, hey, this is actually a pretty low risk thing they're doing. So let's see what happens.
This makes me want to get into financial health things because that's something we've talked about a lot over the years for different stories I've done, and you have such an interesting perspective here. But I think I don't remember quoting you saying this, but at one point you were saying it would be hard for a checking account to get worse, and I think we were talking about like overdraft fees and like maybe at the time the apps were a little bit clunkier. I know the bigger banks are a bit better, but what's like interesting these days in the financial health scene? Like what would be the digit of today? Doesn't have to be in an automated savings category, but like what?
Why? Yeah, digital today would just be a lot better.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think if you asked Ethan, the founder of Digit, we could do a better Digit. Like the technology is just so much better now. You could be a much better coach, not just like sweep a little bit of money into a side pocket, but like actually giving you advice on what to do. I think the problem of the Digit to today is that business would have so much regulatory risk associated with it that no one would fund it.
Mm.
We'd have a business that still has to sweep money into an account, which turned out to be hard for Digit to even keep up without running afoul of some regulations.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was a terrible enforcement action for the CFPB to bring.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah,
that was incredibly chilling. The business had done nothing but try to be on the right side of it, and like the idea that we're going to make a big rigmarole out of kind of a small time stuff, I thought it just seemed trite, and I think a really bad policy. I'm sure that it was accurate, but like I just don't think of how you want to encourage the market to evolve. It's certainly slowed down and happened in consumer products.
Mm-hmm.
But you'd have that still to deal with. You'd have to deal with the fact that this AI agent would be telling somebody advice that sounds like financial advice. So are they an RIA? Well, what's their how are those their record keeping logs looking like? What are they advising on? Or are they a fiduciary? You can just imagine it could be too complicated.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I think you do need to kind of take a step back on stuff. Like I'd like to go back to an environment where there was some space for people to innovate. What Digit was created, CFPB had Project Catalyst.
Oh, I remember that.
Talking to people about how to solve these problems. There were actual government employees meeting with startups and giving them advice on how they could comply with the law and what they could do. They were talking about fintech sandboxes. They were creating no action letters. You could try these things out.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. But what a terrible, I mean, I hate these names though. Fintech sandbox. No. But you're bringing me back.
It's like that game Hot Lava, the little kids playing sandbox.
Yeah.
You can't touch the sand because it's lava.
But like I'm picturing men in suits mostly. It's just like it just seems strange. Well, I saw in the news in mid-January that Barclays was sunsetting its Brise, its fintech program. So I don't have any insight to that, but it's just that's another example of something changing. Ryan, what are you seeking when you're seeking like early stage? What are there like core qualities or are there like flavors that you're especially looking for? And I am especially interested in like anything cooking on the gig side, because I know year after year everyone's like, we need fintech or bank accounts that are better for the gig workers, but it seems like harder to find something that's big. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so we try to be like the first investors into companies. Really.
That is like the hardest job.
Yeah, and the key is we're just looking for people. Like we're generally wanting to, and there's three of us. We all talk to every founder, and we all kind of asking slightly different questions. We would generally we want to see the tech business. We want to see the tech business, like they're actually able to like code and like, build the product themselves. Like that's kind of but there's not a lot of money and resources. I generally we're really relying on the founders oftentimes to bring the best ideas to us. So we're not really out there of like a thesis of like, hey, I think there's an opportunity here. It is really kind of an open, try to be an open book and, encounter founders and kind of hear where they're taking the market. They tend to have a better insight on where the opportunities are.
Mm-hmm.
And then, the big thing we're looking for is just the speed of execution. So going to that, original point on kind of these AI tools go, they just speed up these companies. And that's the real thing, is that the faster that they move, the more things they could try, the more the mistakes they can make, the more progress they can make in a shorter period of time. And that's really the advantage of startups. And so those are kind of really the three things that we're looking for. As far as, kind of what we're seeing, you continue to see a lot of innovation leverage within financial services.
Mm-hmm.
Financial services is really two things. There's a license and there's a bunch of services.
Way to make it sound so interesting.
Pretty simple.
Wow. You should write its tagline.
And the services piece some of those are really susceptible to the kind of LLMs and some of these new technologies at a wholesale, like dramatically reducing costs. And so you see a lot of that where someone's going to, use AI to, replace some paper-based process or some reporting function that, creates reports with an audience of 1 or an audience of 0. There's a lot of those in banks. And so that's a kind of constant theme we're seeing right now. We're seeing a lot still on compliance. I mean, going to kind of the theme of some of the earlier questions around where you see the regulation going. The regulatory environment has increased to such a degree that you now see a lot of companies that are saying, well, hey, we can solve this particular compliance issue. We can help the bank navigate this particular part of the partnership. We can provide some additional oversight over this function. And that continues to be a pretty active theme. You don't see it on consumer though. So unfortunately on the gig side, that still is a pretty quiet area. We love consumer. I always like doing consumer deals. I think that's where all the money's in consumer, but it's, you don't see as much right now. I think a lot of that is to do with it. Just the kind of general perception that it's just harder right now from an investment standpoint, from partnership and those kinds of things.
Yeah. Well, Ryan, I have 2 questions left for you. And one is tied to this. And it's like, so how are you finding all these founders? Are they finding you? Or what's if a bank, some bankers really want to connect more to fintech founders, but seem to, they'll go to trade shows, but I don't know if that's the most natural way to do it, but maybe it is. But what works for you?
So we do get a lot of people who are inbound to us, and then we try to be very open. So if something makes an introduction, or if we get inbound, cold inbound that kind of makes sense, we're going to talk to those founders. We try to be helpful on those calls, and so that has a little bit of a flywheel after a while. And so that's a significant source of kind of deal flow for us. We also do a lot to kind of get out there and kind of get the word out of what we're doing, kind of try to identify where we see opportunities and, get the word out about why we see opportunities in fintech. So we just published a piece earlier in January that was kind of with state of the market and where we see some of these technology trends driving things, and where we can see some opportunities in the market, in particular around leveraging AI, and we're even starting to see some innovations in quantum and some of the new kind of form factors that we expect to kind of be released over the next couple of years. And then we do events. So we actually did an event earlier this week where we called Go Restive, where we invited founders who had an idea, who might have been just kind of launching the product, to come and hear from founders who are further along in their journey, to meet other partners, other investors like ourselves, maybe investors further downstream from us, and really kind of help them on their journey. And in doing so, obviously, we get to meet them too.
Yeah. No, that's cool. I'll make sure to drop a link to your report in the show notes. So anyone listening, check the description in the podcast episode, because you'll find the link to that. And Ryan, I'll have one last question for you, but open it up to you. Kind of ties to this. How should people reach out to you? Any last thoughts for what to expect in 2025 when it's already been, just brutal?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, getting a hold of us is pretty straightforward. I'm Ryan at restive.com. Know me. I'm on Twitter, Ryan _ Falvey, or X, as they call it.
Yeah. I know it feels weird though, right? I'm on X. It sounds like you're on a drug, but
The U.S.
sort of
government
feels like it.
made mortal.
Yeah.
And then what to expect. I mean, I certainly I think it's probably I think we're going to go into a very favorable period for fintech startups.
Mm-hmm.
That will probably be marked by less enforcement, and maybe more openness for partnerships, and probably more capital. My only caution would be is many of these rules are laws and they have long statutes of limitations. So if you're building a business in financial services, like despite kind of the headlines and the near-term politics, I would definitely continue to focus on investing in compliance and a lot of those processes and the legal side of things. Like that is never not going to be important.
Underscore that. Plus one.
And a lot of the companies that we've seen get into trouble, frankly, were somewhat infamous for their lack of compliance and process and controls before they got in trouble. So I do think that will always be really important. And so kind of wherever the winds are blowing, like that's a competitive advantage, because financial services is just marked by just volatility, and it's getting more and more. It's getting more and more volatile. Where in the last 4 or 5 years, there's been like twice where we thought like basically the financial services industry is going to just end, and like fintech was been over, and then they like came raging back, and there was going to be like a new currency that would replace everything, and then we were like, there's a lot, and it kind of goes ups and downs. So if you've been
it's a true soap opera, like
a bit of a soap opera.
Yeah.
Even for what you're trying to do, like you stick with it and kind of stay focused. And what matters, it really does pay off. And I think you can really change the market in a really positive way.
And Ryan, last question. What is the photo on your phone's lock screen?
My phone's lock screen?
Mm-hmm.
It's a picture of one of my children.
Aw. Oh my gosh, you just picked one.
Cool opportunity. I alternate them. So currently the lock screen is my daughter, and when my son had the lock screen for a while, so I needed to kind of, I don't want to create any complexes.
Well, that's important. I know. My mom does that. My mom does that for her grandkids. Yeah. It's a good way to go. Well, Ryan, thanks so much for joining me on Money Isn't Everything. It's a pleasure to see you again.
Thanks for having me. It's a lot of fun.
So the one thing I learned is a prediction, but it's a good one, so I'm going to share it. And that's that the heyday of being able to go partner with a banking as a service provider and get live within a couple of weeks for a fintech is probably not coming back soon. And that's likely a good thing. I hope you join me 2 weeks from now, because we're in for a treat. I'm in conversation with the co-founders of a company I really, really have been wanting to interview for a while, and that's the Cobalt Cowboys, where their tagline is, "It's not our first rodeo." See you then.